Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/home soon.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. We are back with our first show after our summer break. We're in the, not technically in the fall, but in the fall cycle of political news. We're going to catch up on some topics, hit the ground running with what has been an incredibly busy week in politics as well. We're going to bring in the panel, do some reintroductions here. Jeff Ferrier, a longtime New Democrat strategist, formerly worked in the Ministry of Health. You know him each and every week. Allie, superstar conservative strategist, co-led Pierre Poilievre's leadership bid here in BC. And Jillian's off this week, so we have Port Coquitlam Mayor and future Premier Brad West joining us here today. Brad, I know you don't like that introduction, but thank you for being here anyways.
I'll slip you that 20 spot in a bit.
That's
Rob.
Right. Okay.
Thanks.
Well, it goes up the closer you get to being Premier, so it'll be higher next time. But all right, it was a week of highs and lows for the NDP government. Premier David Eby, the lows, and we're going to start with his comments on temporary foreign workers, blaming them for stealing the jobs of BC's youth, among other things, causing a backlash. But the high ending the week, scoring big in Prime Minister Mark Carney's new major projects list. So let's start with the temporary foreign worker comments. Filling up homeless shelters, draining food banks, taking kids' jobs. The program's got to be reformed or canceled. Brad, I know you've had some thoughts on this. What did you think of what the Premier said and how it kind of played out during the week?
Well, it's been interesting because I've been quite a long-standing critic of the temporary foreign worker program. Back when Christy Clark, remember her? She announced with a lot of fanfare that there was going to be a new mine opening up in northern BC. And oh yeah, by the way, all the mining jobs were going to go to temporary foreign workers because we can't find any Canadians who know how to mine, apparently. So I do think there's a lot of concern with the temporary foreign worker program. It's kind of notorious at this point. Lots of examples of mistreatment of workers, and really a program that was designed to be quite surgical had the floodgates open over the last number of years. And you can see that through the rapid increase in the number of people who are coming through that program. So I think there's legitimate concerns there. I think that that's also well-founded in a plethora of public opinion polls. Now, I think probably where the Premier maybe had a bit of a misstep was in really personalizing his comments around the temporary foreign workers themselves. And I've had the opportunity previously to have some conversations with people who are temporary foreign workers. They're not doing anything wrong in that they're trying to make a better life for their family. I think just about anyone who's in their circumstance would probably do the same. Problem is the way the government has set up this program and the abuse that corporate Canada has undergone with it. I know there was a bit of a walk back on that. I think, again, I would be disappointed if, because of the way it was, the comments were made, that somehow this discussion just exits stage left, because I do think that there is a real conversation needs to happen in our province and our country around this program.
Yeah, you mentioned, and I'll go to Jeff here on this, but Brad mentioned that polling, and we do see national polling in the last week that would indicate the public sentiment against both the temporary foreign worker program and immigration levels in general playing a factor in how some people feel about a host of different issues. Jeff, do you think that polling is playing into a factor in what the Premier is doing here?
I think that has more of it's more of a factor in the comments Pierre Poilievre has made at the national level than it does with the Premier. The Premier addressed this really awkwardly, and that's what his worship was talking about in his earlier comments. I think there's a broad consensus that if Canada First means anything, it should start with young Canadians trying to get their first job. The problem with the program isn't the people, as Brad has said. It's a program that was set up to fill genuine shortages in the labor market, and we're not in that situation anymore. And that's certainly the case with young people. And no one's talking about it. No one's talking about young people today who are already priced out of housing, struggling to find a family doctor. And now they can't find work, almost 15% unemployment rate. And there are many reasons for this, but the temporary foreign worker program and the floodgates being opened on that is certainly one of them. So government should support folks who are in the program here and now. That's, it's exploitation, what's happening with them, pure and simple. But if the premier is going to move forward on, as you pointed out earlier on, a winding down of the program that is becoming more deeply and deeply unpopular with Canadians, he's going to have to confront people in his own party whose sense of patriotism was very loud in the shipyards over BC ferries, but it doesn't. It has not yet spoken about young Canadians trying to pay for school, trying to make ends meet, being denied jobs at home at places like Boston Pizza and Tim Hortons because there can't possibly be people here who know how to sell pizza and coffee and donuts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do think, Allie, one of the things that seemed to rankle NDP supporters, amongst other things, was the fact that Eby was repeating what Pierre Poilievre said just a day before, and the alignment that immediately became a story of the NDP premier and the federal Conservative leader both going after the temporary foreign worker program. It seemed like, from what I could see, there was a visceral reaction to that in some of the reaction as well.
I did have an existential crisis of, am I an NDPer? When he said that.
Did you look deep in the mirror and go, what's going on?
What is happening here? But I joke, but there's a point to be made about where the Conservatives landed on this and where BC landed on this. But I'll start with, I think that the Conservative Party federally said it best when they said it's time to buy Canadian and hire Canadian by ending the temporary foreign worker program, which I'm very hopeful will replace this elbows up thing, because I think that's a little last season. It's not working. Let's put that behind us and move forward with this new slogan, because I think it's really going to work. And I think that a lot of people really appreciate it. There's this thing that a lot of political people and strategists will talk about, and it's the Tim Hortons case study, where there's these group of older political folks who will gather at Tim Hortons in the morning and chat politics. And I will argue it's actually one of the better things of figuring out what's happening on the ground as far as sentiments than any poll that we could ever talk about. And isn't it just so ironic that we're talking about Tim Hortons, Boston Pizza, where David Eby mentioned both of these in his Burnaby Board of Trade speech of something's not really working here. And so if the changes are eventually implemented, it'll be Tim Hortons through this political group that will see it first. And hopefully that is the track that we're going. Now, to my existential crisis, John Rustad responded in this 24-hour period where he then said, well, I don't know if we should go that far of restructuring the temporary foreign worker program quite yet, because this impacts this major stakeholder, the agriculture community in BC. Meanwhile, Dallas Brody from One BC is saying, stop immigration, stop renewals, let's shut it all down. And so we're seeing that how these two political parties on the right are different in their narrative and how they're approaching this. Now, thankfully, the leader of the Conservatives finally figured out that while there is an importance on this major stakeholder group with the agriculture community, David Eby and Pierre Poilievre are right that these things need to be looked at and changed, because it's just the world that we live in now in Canada. So we're back on track. My CPC membership, my CPBC membership are still in good standing.
Yeah, it is
Welcome to the party, Allie. Join the party. Be one of us.
I would ask you, Brad, where your membership card is, but you've joined. Everyone wants you from all political parties, so it's probably a moot point. But it is
Coquitlam first party, Rob.
Yeah. It is fascinating to watch the different dynamics there too, because we do need temporary foreign workers, and some people tried to make that argument. There aren't a lot of BC youth who want to go out on a farm and pick berries in the summer, and we saw that during COVID when we had that problem. But no one, it quickly devolved into a kind of immigrant bashing conversation, which complicated things as well. And by the end of the week, I don't know if we're any wiser or closer to any of the reforms that actually need to happen in the program, but it was a big topic of discussion. And I want to add an element and go around again here because we did get new polling out on the Premier's performance and on where he's landing on issues and popularity. David Eby's approval rating dropped 5 points, according to Angus Reid, to 41%, tying him for the second least popular Premier in Canada alongside Doug Ford. Second quarter drop in a row, lowest approval rating since taking office in December 2022, and also some new party polling from Angus Reid this week, having the Conservatives at 44% in BC and the NDP at 42%, probably within the margin of error. Brad, is that worrying, I think? Will people find that worrying within the NDP that the Premier is dropping a little bit? It is still much higher than John Rustad, but how do you think those numbers land in and around New Democrats?
Well, to state the obvious, you always rather be up than down. So anytime you see some downward trajectory, I think you need to take stock of why that is. The government's had a pretty rough go the last little bit. I reflect on the Charlie Pollock situation that really seized the attention of the public for quite some time in the province. We have a lot of economic headwinds headed our way, and I think people are really starting to feel that. It's not just news reports; it's reflective in their daily life. And then we see some of these other challenges that continue to linger, sentiments around BC ferries. And of course, now what we're just talked about. Government's had a rough go. And, I sense, and I hear this from people, that, government maybe is losing control of the narrative. What is their message? When President Trump started to do his saber rattling and we had tariffs, they quickly pivoted towards that sort of elbows up and all the cliches that I think are getting quite tiring. But I think the public only has so much time for that. And I think there's starting to be a little bit of exhaustion with everything being Donald Trump's fault. And they're looking for our leaders to put out a very clear plan and vision for the future. And I don't know if that is really coming through from the messaging we hear from the provincial government. And when it does come through, you have people doing, yeah, but what about that? We're Team Canada. Yeah, but you're having ferries built in China. There's all these things where it seems that actions are not meeting words. And I think that is creating, those dynamics are creating these political challenges for the government.
Mm-hmm. No, I think you're right. The lost control of the narrative is certainly something you see the government kind of rolling with the punches rather than Jeff throwing the punches themselves. What do you make of the numbers? And there is that old line in politics, that you don't have to be a 10 to win an election. If your opponent's a 2, you only need to be a 3. So David Eby's polling numbers are still better than John Rustad's. What does that mean as well, Jeff?
Well, on a personal leadership level, that's true. Party, you see, it's pretty much a dead heat if you look at the margin of error in that Angus Reid poll. And I'll give you the typical caveat. It's a small sample size. It's one poll among many. It's margin of error. But, the NDP loses on the economy. It's their Achilles heel. People think that they're well suited to deal with healthcare, education, social policy, even that they're on the side of workers. But when the economy goes down in a tailspin, that's when folks start to turn away from the NDP. And so it should be concerning to the Premier. It should be concerning to the government. It should be concerning to folks within the party who think that there's room to, really go hard against the government at a time when the alternative is a heck of a lot worse. But at the end of the day, this is about the Premier, and he's got to stop telling folks about Donald Trump. He's got to stop telling folks about what the difficulties are and why we're where we're at. And he needs to start showing progress, in particular on the narrative that he has been moving forward around the need for BC to build to push back against Donald Trump so that we have jobs and workers and we can stand on our own 2 feet. I think for many folks right now, that's coming across as words, and he needs to do more of what he did this week. And we can talk about that later, about actually showing the benefits of the government's focus on bringing on big projects, about building, about getting people working on those. We can talk about that later.
Yeah. Well, and also, like, that's a new focus from the government. It wasn't their focus in the last election or even a year ago. It wasn't man of action, David Eby's focus when he took office. This new version of natural resource projects is relatively new in terms of showing action as well. So he hasn't had a long runway to do that. Allie, what do you make of the numbers?
I want to contextualize the circumstance to what Brad was talking about with his mention of that David Eby has had a rough go at it. That's indeed self-inflicted, but the other being that in comparison to who? By that I mean that David Eby and the NDP rode high during the election because the Liberals were doing well and Mark Carney was successful, and it was in comparison to this bromance that they had going on. And then equally, in comparison to our neighbor down south, we looked more inward towards our own politicians versus in their competitor as being Donald Trump and not the true opposition. By that, I mean that it was David Eby against Donald Trump, not David Eby versus John Rustad. And by all accounts, what this essentially means is that the polling numbers for David Eby going down is because of all of the things happening on the Trump side, and because now Mark Carney's been in the role for quite some time, and he's having to prove whether or not these campaign promises will actually come to fruition. And so he's being judged by a lot of circumstances that are federally attached, which may or may not be fair. And so it's interesting because in comparison to the conservative numbers that are now going up, I question whether or not is it because it's the opposition is doing an effective job, or because of these external circumstances like federal funding coming into BC or their lack thereof being the main problem.
I want to just kind of segue off of that into the Prime Minister's nation-building project list on Friday. 2 of the 5 projects in BC, LNG Canada Phase 2 and the Red Chris mine expansion. BC's Premier very pleased about this. Seemed like he's got the Prime Minister's ear. They're on the same page. And no oil pipeline from Alberta. That did not make the cut. Brad, anything we can take away from this alignment of BC and Ottawa based on that list, do you think?
Well, it was good to see. Obviously, anytime British Columbia gets the attention of folks in Ottawa, I think we all are shocked but thrilled. So, it was good to see, and I'm sure kudos are in order to the Premier and others who worked to make that happen. For me, lots of things always sound good. It will be about the follow through. And does this actually result in what the Prime Minister has said, which is, a fast tracking, shovels in the ground, let's go. It wouldn't be the first time that a politician promised that, and the results were not that. So let's wait and see, but positive sign.
The complicating factor, Jeff, I guess, is that technically the 2 projects, LNG Canada Phase 2 and Red Chris, they don't even need federal help. They're both pretty much already approved. So in that sense, what is do you take away any actual value from this?
Well, sure. Certainly on the Premier's backing of the Anglo Tech deal, that's a big deal for British Columbia. And folks know I work in the mining sector, so you'd be forgiven of thinking I'm a bit of a homer on that. But getting a Canadian headquarters of a giant global mining company and securing $5 billion in investment, it's a big deal there. LNG Canada has gotten the approvals, but it needs to go to its board and get to a final investment decision. This will help. And there's a lot of things that makes mining tough in northwestern British Columbia: access to power, infrastructure, roads, skilled workforce. And these are signals from the federal government that they're going to be at the table helping those companies make sure they can move ahead quick. So it's consequential, and the Premier will be happy about it because it helps him push his narrative about BC building to push back against Trump.
And it avoids a showdown on pipelines, Allie. Like, we don't have to have that in the immediate future with Alberta and BC.
Not yet being the key word for that. I mean, there's a whole office dedicated to it that hopefully has a long lifespan, and maybe that will come. I'll say this just to echo a little bit of what I was picking up from Brad. I mean, the follow through is important here. What this means is essentially that Mark Carney created a list of things that he's going to be able to go to a ribbon cutting very easily and claim that it was all his office that made it happen. But really, these things were in the process a long time, way before he entered the scene. What I was hopeful that the next announcements would potentially be are more innovative, visionary things like an oil pipeline. I'll finish to say that what this does also offer is a bit of a chance to make sure that the regulatory challenges that we face here in BC will now have a champion on the federal side to make things happen quicker, which that's where we should really be watching this office, is not so much the investments, it's rather the policy changes that are going to happen federally that will allow the path for a lot of these projects to not have any more blocks and challenges.
Mm-hmm. It does feel like more of a kind of a public endorsement by the Prime Minister on mining and LNG, which the Premier said is a different tone than the Justin Trudeau administration, which was not supportive of LNG, and a message to investors that if you want to do a mine in northwestern BC, you want to do an LNG project, the federal government wants you here and wants you spending your billions of dollars doing it, maybe above and beyond just these two projects, which you're right, are pretty much done or potentially done through the approval process without Ottawa. We've run out of time to get to the BCGEU strike issue if you're watching us on television or on YouTube, but we do have an audio podcast. Subscribe to that. We're going to talk a bit about that and some other issues and break down some more topics from BC politics this week. Thank you to the panel for being here. Thank you to future Premier West for being here, and thank you for watching and coming back to the show for our fall season. We'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn how Uber and Mad Canada are reducing impaired driving at uber.com/homesoon.